It is my pleasure to bring to you our next session, Capable Citizens, How India Outsources Justice for Gendered Violence. The discussion today is based on the book by Poulami Roychowdhury, who is Assistant Professor of Sociology at McGill University. Her research focuses on gender, politics, and governance. Her research is funded by the Fulbright Foundation, the National Science Foundation, and the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. The moderator for this session is Mander, who is a human rights and peace worker, writer, columnist, researcher, and teacher who works with survivors of mass violence, hunger, homeless persons, and street children. He recently organized a journey of solidarity and conscience to families affected by hate violence across India called Karwan-e-Mohabbat. He served as a member of the Prime Minister's National Advisory Council from June 2010 to 2012 and is the founder of Aman Biradari Campaign for Secularism, Peace and Justice. Presently also the director of the Center for Equity Studies. The panelists for the day, and it is my pleasure to introduce you to them, are Madhav Khosla, who is a junior fellow at the Harvard Society of Fellows. He studied political theory at Harvard University, where his dissertation was awarded the Edward M. Chase Prize for the best dissertation on a subject relating to the promotion of world peace. And he further studied law at Yale Law School and the National Law School of India University, Bangalore. We have with us Pratiksha Bakshi, who has been teaching at the Center for the Study of Law and Governance since 2006. Her book, Public Secrets of Law, Rape Trials in India, which was published by OUP, is a courtroom ethnography that brings together her interest in sociology of law, feminist theory, and violence. Bakshi initiated the formation of the Law and Social Sciences Research Network, anchored at the Center for the Study of Law and Governance, Jawaharlal Nehru University. It is with great pleasure I would like to introduce you now to Radhika Govinda Rajan, who is a cultural anthropologist working across the fields of multi-species ethnography, environmental anthropology, the anthropology of religion, South Asian studies, and political anthropology. Her research is motivated by a long-standing interest in understanding how human relationships with non-human in South Asia are variously drawn into and shape broader issues of cultural, political, and social relevance. She teaches courses on animal studies, South Asia, the anthropology of religion, the history of anthropology, the post-human turn, ethnography, and agrarian and environmental studies. Over to the chair.
Thank you. Friends, I'm privileged to moderate this discussion. It's a very exciting book with unexpected insights, Poulami Roychowdhury's Capable Citizens. It tries to look carefully at a question that many feminist scholars have examined, but she comes up with, as I said, answers that one does not expect. She asks what happens when women survivors of violence seek justice from the criminal justice system. And we expect her to find, for instance, that the criminal justice system is irredeemably sexist, patriarchal, classist, oppressive, and is incapable or unwilling to deliver justice. We expect alternately a finding that it does selectively provide justice, but only when it casts women into a model of victimhood. Her findings, based on about 70 careful ethnographies, is quite different. What she says is that the criminal justice system doesn't say, go away, we won't help. Instead, it says, go ahead, we will help you, but only by your helping yourself. So in a sense, what she's arguing is that the criminal justice system has supplanted exclusion by inclusion and participation, while still not assuming the responsibility of itself delivering justice. And the outcomes then for the survivor of injustice is a mixed one. this is like the spoiler, and I'm sure when she presents her findings, you will understand her argument in greater detail. I just wanted to sort of start off with two observations when I read through her manuscript. First is that much of it resonates, much of her findings resonates with my experience, with one part of my experience. So survivors of mass violence with whom I have worked for many, many years, somebody like, say, Bilkis Bano, if she had not been through what she went through, she would have been an unlettered dairy farmer's wife, spending a normal conventional life. Instead, at the age of 19, when she sees 14 members of her family, she's gang raped by her own neighbors. Most of her family, her mother, her sisters-in-law, are stripped naked, like her, gang raped. Her little daughter of 3 years, her head is smashed on the ground. And she survives all of this, and she becomes one of the most courageous fighters for justice. So she transforms. So in a sense, the stories, although her stories are of domestic violence, her stories are of how these incidents and in the battle for justice, how the survivors themselves transform. And that resonates, that story resonated a lot with me. But there's somebody lesser known called Naseem who lost 29 members of her family. Again, I worked with her for many years, and I just watch her in amazement how she has become a leader of other women, and it's that transformation that she underlines, but also she talks about some of the limitations of that. But on the other hand, I was telling her over lunch that I also wanted to place before her, before she presents her findings, another part of my experience where her findings don't resonate in the same way. And this is the work that I've done with homeless women. If there's a single segment of our demographic who I think suffers the greatest amount of unremitting abuse throughout their lives, it is homeless women. Because it is homelessness, extreme domestic violence that puts them on the streets. And on the streets, this is all that they endure. The first homeless shelter that we had set up for homeless women, I asked them what has changed most in your life. And one of the women said, for the first time in 17 years, I can now close my eyes at night and know that till morning nobody is going to rape me. I think for the men in this room, including myself, we cannot even begin to imagine what life would look like in these circumstances. But even for the women, one act of sexual violence, we struggle with it all our life. But what happens if every single night you are going to be raped and there's no place of safety you can go to, no one in the criminal justice system who is going to even listen to your complaint, no one in civil society is going to go out and march with candles in your support. No space to become the kind of empowered, capable citizen that you speak about. So I want to say that your story is both truthful and for another set of survivors, it raises questions. So over to Poulami, and we look forward to your presentation about the book.
So much. Can you all hear me? Yeah. And thank you, Ashu, and everyone else, all of the people who made this possible. It's been lovely so far. And thank you for reading this book, which, unlike the other books, is not finished and therefore was possibly more painful for all of you to read. So I think Harsh has summarized the main findings of my book very well. So what I'll tell you about is a particular case which might populate the empirical findings a little better. So the way that I started this work was I was actually working on microfinance, and I was going around to all these organizations and and microfinance banks. And what was surprising is that nobody actually wanted to talk to me about microfinance. They wanted to talk about violence against women. And what that indicates is that this is a place where the issue of sexual violence, domestic violence, has been at the core of the women's movement for, several decades now. And it motivates a lot of action on the ground. So we know a lot about the policy level reforms that have happened, but there's massive amounts of intervention in daily cases and daily allegations. So what the book became was an ethnography of how these political interventions actually impact how governance happens, how the state responds, how law enforcement personnel behave. And so the very, short answer to that question is that, as Harsh mentioned, I was expecting to find one of two possibilities. That one, that law enforcement personnel, don't they are, really, I have to also think about the positive possibility, which I always forget to do. Well, the most positive possibility of political movements, right, is that law enforcement personnel actually become responsive, that they help women, etc. That is not what I found. But I also didn't find what gender and legal scholars talk about everywhere, which is this management through protectionism, right? So that we manage politics by saying, okay, we're going to look for the woman who is the good victim. And we know this, right? We know how this plays out when there's cases in the media. There's always victim blaming. Oh, she was wearing a tight dress, whatever, right? So the usual response that academics as well as a lot of lawyers I know are expecting from law enforcement personnel is that they manage these claims by saying, okay, you woman, you look like a bad woman, so I'm not going to help you, whatever. I didn't find that either. What I found was that responsiveness was highly attuned to political considerations, i.e., how politically connected and well organized the victim was, who was supporting her, how much disturbance they could cause, if they could threaten the job security of the particular law enforcement personnel, etc. So that was the calculation, and the response when a police officer or a protection officer or a member of the court thought that this woman was sufficiently politically threatening, the response was not to do their job, but to say, okay, you can go ahead, but you will have to fill out the FIR or the DIR. You will have to gather witnesses. You will have to help me gather evidence. You'll have to make sure that these witnesses show up to court, right? So this is the outsourcing of administrative functions that I describe in the book. And the implications of it, obviously for governance, is that this is a governmental regime that manages political challenges by incorporating women. Not necessarily by suppressing or neglecting, but by saying, hey, become one of us, help yourself, participate in this process. What this does is twofold. One is it actually protects the state, not survivors necessarily. Two, it creates a field where women who were previously just going to get denied when they go to the cops, they have an opportunity, right, which they didn't have before. So they have the opportunity to become this kind of subject, this capable woman who goes around and, fills out a report and convinces people to testify on her behalf. But it also affords the opportunity to fail miserably and to actually become, once again, vulnerable to retaliatory violence. So the case I want to tell you very briefly about, and then I'll end, how much time do I have at this point? Does anybody know? Okay. So the case I'll just tell you about, and I'll end with this, is I start the book with two women who come together, Brenda and Rupa. They're both from lower caste backgrounds, both working class, grew up in villages, educated until about grade 6. And the context under which they come together is that Brenda, who, it's actually quite confusing what happened to her. There's multiple reports, but from what I could piece together, she was trafficked by her own husband after years of abuse. And she somehow gets out of this brothel, and she comes and seeks help with this women's organization, and she meets the caseworker there, Rupa, who is herself a survivor of violence, who has been, through the process of fighting her own legal case, has become a caseworker at this organization and is now helping other women. So what ends up happening is that Brenda, like almost all of the women I met and interviewed, did not want to file a legal case. So what she wanted was just help, surviving, getting by. But the organization itself convinces her to approach the state because they think registering a case will actually give her ammunition for the other things that she wants out of life, right? So even if you don't get a court order, if you can file an FIR, you might, get some money out of this abusive man. So they convince her to actually approach the state and engage with the law. So she does. Interestingly, they do not file a case under the Trafficking Act. They file under domestic violence, 498A, the criminal act. This process then leads to the police, who do not necessarily, they're sitting in front of this woman, Brenda, who by all accounts is not a good victim in any sense of the term. But they do know that the organization that supports her has 19,000 members in that locality who vote and who can cause a disturbance. So they say, okay, go ahead and file a 498A case, but you will have to do all of the things that I have just specified, including helping us complete this criminal investigation because we're so overburdened. So this moves forward. Brenda, in the process of actually trying to be capable in these ways, is once again beaten up by her ex-husband. Rupa is also attacked. And at the end of my book, I come back to these two women because what we see is Rupa is getting something out of this process. She has, to a certain extent, become capable in the ways that the state now encourages women to be. She has a job, she fends for herself, she puts her child through school, she has built herself a bakka bathroom, all sorts of things that are very, very meaningful gains for her. Whereas the last time I saw Brenda, she was in a hospital because she had tried to take her own life. And in her own words, she said, I don't want to actually live this life, right? So I guess I'll just conclude with that, which is that the system that I saw unfolding in front of me, that the way that the criminal justice system manages the politics of women's rights is by creating a field where some people can actually get something new that they previously would have been denied, but it also puts already very vulnerable women in situations of heightened vulnerability, where they're called on to take on an extra burden of work that's actually quite dangerous. And in Brenda's case, led her to not even want to survive the violence that she had experienced. So I'll just end there.
Thank you. Thanks, Poulami. So as I said, it's an interesting and very different perspective on how survivors of domestic violence encounter the criminal justice system, and how the criminal justice system, in a sense, responds by incorporating them in the battle for justice and withdrawing from their own responsibilities. So this is a very interesting perspective. I'll request the three commentators to take about 10 minutes each, so that we have enough time for a discussion with the audience. So Radhika, we'll go this way.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me in the back? So I just want to begin by saying that this was such a wonderful book, and I'm really grateful for the invitation to read it and to respond to it. You've had a sense of the argument, but what I want to say is that the thing that struck me the most as I read it was the ways in which Poulami is able to strike a note and a position of critical empathy as she examines the lives of those whose lives intersect with the law, whether it's state officials, survivors of domestic violence, or NGO workers. There's a way in which she's able to understand the conundrums that they navigate in the course of these intersections with the law that always remain critical but empathetic. There's a lot that I could say about that, but I'll try and keep my comments short, and I'll restrict them to two themes that really jumped out at me as I read the book. I was struck particularly by how beautifully the book introduces us to the ways in which kinship and politics become imbricated in the course of everyday life. Poulami doesn't necessarily call this a book about kinship, but I was struck by how much different understandings of what it means to create kin and to live in relation to others pervaded every level of analysis. So I'll tell you a little bit about that. There was the expected dimension of kinship, the fact that survivors of domestic violence had to navigate their relationships to both their marital families and their natal families as they decided to file a case or keep a case going. And one of the things that Poulami does really well is introduce us to the difficulties of women who actually don't want to file cases or who want to stay with abusive husbands, whose parents push them into staying with abusive husbands, whose uncles accuse them of having done something wrong, of sisters-in-law who accuse survivors of wanting to come back home and take over property. And she navigates these complex kinds of social relations in a way that is very powerful. But the thing I found more interesting was the ways in which both NGOs and the state traffic constantly in the language and in the practices of kinship in very unexpected ways. They both troubled kin ties in that they called upon survivors of domestic violence in many cases to cut off ties to their families, at the same time that they reintroduced and reinforced biological metaphors of family. So I'll give you an example for both. With NGOs, Poulami walks us through how NGO workers who were trying to convince women to file cases were constantly frustrated by the attachments of survivors of domestic violence to kin families. We hear multiple workers who talk about the difficulty of working with these women who are unable to see what it means to move out of these families, to finally come into their own. And what I loved about the book was how poignant some of this work is. So Poulami tells us about a retreat, a capacity building conference almost, where one of the NGOs decides to take survivors of domestic violence to this conference site. They're going on the bus, and this NGO worker decides that these women need to come into themselves as individual subjects with self-esteem and with joy, and they play Munni Badnaam Hui on the bus, and some of the women get up and dance, and it's this joyous moment where they're able to discover doing things for themselves and acting in licentious ways that would get them punished at home. Once they reach the center, they watch a film, Man Ke Manjeere, which follows the real-life story of Shamim Pathan, who's a domestic violence survivor who left her husband and became a truck driver. And the film follows the life of Shamim as she picks up other survivors of domestic violence and takes them with her. And these women are shown driving across the desert, singing, stopping at dhabas, all the things that good women are not supposed to do. And she tells us in the book about how the women watching this film are whistling, getting up in their seats, enjoying themselves. And they're reminded that this is the kind of kinship that they could have by NGO workers. Right? So even as NGO workers are insisting on the individuality of women, they're also reminding them constantly that they can make other kinds of kin with other survivors of domestic violence, kin with like-minded women. And yet there's also a fundamental violence to this kin-making process, right? As with all families, families are sites of violence. How does the violence emerge here? After they watch the film, the NGO workers decide that all these women must disrobe. They must experience their naked bodies. They must lose shame. Upon hearing this, one of the women decides to flee, and she's running for the door, and she's pulled back in and forcibly disrobed because she must experience her body to gain freedom. And that violence is something that you bring out so well, the complexity of that violence and the belief that this is the right thing to do to produce individual subjects. And the ways in which NGO workers are constantly navigating that desire to abandon kinship while creating its own kinds of violent forms is something that I find really powerful about the book. The state, too, is really deeply imbricated in everyday kinship. And I don't mean just the state at a large level, the everyday state, police officials. One of the most poignant moments in the book is, and the funniest actually, is this moment where Poulami has entered the office of the station officer, Boro Babu, who is breaking out in hives because of the tension of having all these women come to his office and demand justice. And he's upset by this deluge of loose women who now want to file complaints against their husbands. And Boro Babu is sitting there, fretting like a family patriarch, feeling sorry for all the men who are being besieged by these harpies. He has some sympathy for some of them, but on the whole, there is this sense that he is this sad father watching the family fall apart. And there are many other such instances where the state too traffics in the language of kin. And I think, to my mind, that's one of the biggest contributions of the book, that it brings together, actually, the anthropology of kinship and political anthropology in really compelling ways. The second thing I wanted to talk about was the ways in which the law and the social life of the law unfolds in this book. The book is really at one, you can call it an anthropology of the state, it's an anthropology of violence, it's sociology of women's movements, but to my mind, it's also a book about the law and the state. The thing that is so interesting is how much people seek out the law, even as they expect it not to work. So most of the women who go in to file these complaints, firstly, as Poulami tells us, much of this complaining is reluctant. But when they go in to file cases, they don't expect the cases to work, right? What they expect instead is that filing a case will set in motion a chain of complicated events that will somehow allow them to achieve justice within a law that actually does not promise them justice. This reminded me of an observation made by the anthropologist Vishnupad, who argues that the practices and languages of the rule of law, I'm quoting from him here, have become pervasive and efficacious in India, but not in the manner that they ostensibly intended to. The sheer fact of the circulation of the law, he argues, compels a response from a citizenry that is now intimately versed in the languages of the law. But that response is not always to ensure the law's compliance. It is also to transgress the law. It is to hustle the law, to camouflage the law, to fake the law, to wait, to ambush, to feign ignorance. And I think that that comes through really well in the book, that the law is only the beginning, and these women who file these cases are then resorting to all kinds of extra legal measures, whether showing up at their husbands' houses with a constable in tow so that they can reclaim their jewelry, or going to the neighborhood dada and asking him to call the CPIM politician to put pressure. The law is only the start. But how do we then explain, given the fact that women expect the law to fail, expect to do all this work outside the law, how do we explain the fact that the law itself is so important? What is it about the law that commands this kind of attention? How do we understand the charisma of the law, where it's constantly invoked, even as it is constantly subverted? Poulami argues that it is the power that proximity to the state bestows on people that makes them move towards the law. But I would love to hear if there is something to the law itself, outside the ordinary state. What is that appeal of the law? How do we understand why it has this draw? And you invoke, Poulami, a couple of people to think this through. You think of Sudipto Kaviraj, for instance, who argues that despite the everyday failings of the government, there remains an enchantment with the state in India, the broad state. And I wonder if that's part of the argument, but also I wonder if it's also that the law itself might be extra legal, right? That it's not just that the law makes possible extra legality, but I wonder if there is something about the law itself as extra legal that might explain this. But that's all I want to say. It's a wonderful book. I hope you all read it. I'll pass it on.
Thank you, Radh. Thank you for very thoughtful questions. If you could respond at the end for all of us. I go on to Madhav. He comes from perspective both of law and politics, and will give his own.
Thanks very much, Harsh. Just to thank Poulami and to thank Ashu for making this possible. I loved reading the book, and I thought it was hugely interesting. I had sort of two themes that I was most interested in. One, and this kind of takes off nicely from where Radhika ended, which is basically the way in which the book conceptualizes how we understand the domain of the legal. And it seems to push back against two kinds of familiar narratives. So one is the familiar narrative that we conceive of the domain of the legal as a somewhat autonomous space, as a kind of forum of principle which is ruled by and conducted by principles, regulations, arguments, reason, and it is weighed through those metrics. And so even the concepts that we use, from those that govern evidence to those that govern judgment to those that attribute blame, are sort of applied in that way. And of course, as anybody who's familiar even with filing elementary tax returns would realize that the law is anything but that, right? And so one is the book sort of, but it nicely sort of suggests that that narrative clearly isn't at work. But I think what it does more originally is in fact even push back against another kind of narrative, which I actually was expecting to see when I first opened the book, which is the thought that the law is a domain where actually truth no longer exists in the moral imagination. And so it's sort of given up on empiricism in some deep form. And actually, it's not that at all. I mean, the book is not about three powerful people bribing four policemen and two judges and changing the facts and getting away, or you know, some story like that. In fact, it presents it presents the law as a much more strategic, network, embedded type of enterprise. And it's an enterprise that one constantly negotiates, and one is constantly negotiating to further one's objectives and goals and aspirations. And a lot of people have written about that kind of idea with regard to the Indian state more generally, right? That one of the features of the relationship that most people share with the state is that it is a relationship that involves ceaseless negotiation. And the law very much fits into that broader story. I think the interesting question that it raises is the ways in which the fact that the law and other domains have become more porous, what implications has that had both for those domains and for the law, right? And it is one of the features of many a society that the rise of legality corresponds to the decline of the rule of law, right? And it's so sort of one of the interesting things in the book is that sort of comes out. The second sort of feature of the book that I think really comes through, and I found this to be actually quite startling, is sort of the study and the role and the engagement with the idea of state capacity. And it left me with two thoughts, I think. And the one thought is that it nicely captures something that, so as most of you are familiar with, state capacity is one of the most important, boring, and evergreen topics in political science. But one of the interesting things about the literature on state capacity is that it very rarely interrogates the relationship between capacity and power. And one of the interesting things about the book is that it shows how poor capacity also has a certain kind of pathology and a relationship with the abuse of state power. And so one of the peculiar things about capacity is that strong capacity can lead to great abuse, and weak capacity can also lead to great abuse. And the book sort of, I think it's sort of in very subtle and interesting ways, captures how weak capacity can actually lead to dramatic instances of abuse, right? The second thing about the capacity point, which is interesting, and this is something that I've sort of written a bit about and spoken about with others, is how and I think this is sort of maybe in, I think, chapters 6 and 7 is the thought that the efforts to actually increase capacity, efforts to in some sense respond to the problem of capacity in specific instances, in fact, will undermine capacity in the long run and in systemic ways. And so one of the interesting things about what you describe as incorporation, right? And those sort of particular cases where people get incorporated is that a benign way to read that story is to think that, look, this is at least one way in which X victim might be able to achieve some kind of justice given the facts that we are in, right? But the interesting thing is that the minute you do that, and the minute you actually incorporate them, quote unquote, and engage in those kinds of extra legal sort of battles, you've actually undermined the capacity of the system in the long run. Because what you've done is you've sanctioned those extra legal systems. You've weakened your own power to control them and to monopolize them, right? And in some sense, the power and the meaning and the authority of the state rests not on the fact that it has power, but that only it has power, right? And in some sense, this changes that. And you can see that story unfold actually. I mean, there's a book to be written about how this problem of capacity in your book manifests itself across a range of legal domains, right? So take two completely disparate examples that are linked to the identical idea. So in one example, as some of you may be familiar, the Indian Supreme Court now is more responsible for determining which cases it hears than any other, than it has ever been before. And what it has done is it has taken on not only the jurisdiction to decide what it should hear, but also the jurisdiction of what it is in fact hearing, right? Much more from lower courts. And there could be many reasons for that, and there surely are. But one reason for that is undoubtedly the fact that at particular moments, it has felt that it is the better court to judge it because the lower courts aren't capable of doing it. Now, what that has done is that even if in a particular case, it has meant that it goes to the Supreme Court and the Supreme Court fixes the matter, it's taken the pressure off to fix the lower courts, right? And so it's like the old famous quip that the only way to sort of make a bad law or a bad system reform is to enforce it strictly, right? And so you've actually taken the lid off that, and it's the identical story. I mean, the second story, which pertains to some of your, I mean, it pertains in some ways to your book because you relate to some penal provisions, is of course the fascinating anticipatory bail story, right? So India is the only country in the world, I think, which basically has this fascinating get out of jail free card, where the thought is that if I know I'm going to be arrested, I apply to the court for anticipatory bail, and I will therefore be released immediately upon bail, upon being arrested. Now, anticipatory bail was not in the original CRPC, but when it was amended, and then on the basis of a law commission report, it was included. And we had a new CRPC in the 70s, and then under that, there was an amendment after law commission report, anticipatory bail was included. And part of the reason for anticipatory bail was that the police were arresting the wrong people, either because of poor state capacity or because of abuse, and all of that is kind of linked. Now, the solution to that hasn't been to fix the police. The solution to that is to say, okay, you have poor state capacity, you're going to arrest the wrong guy. When you arrest the wrong guy, he gets out. Right? Now, what does this mean? This means that you've created the perverse incentive to actually use arrest as a game within it, where I know that even if I arrest the wrong guy, he can be released. So then I now look at arrest differently, right? And so there is a story to be told there about the relationship between how precisely poor capacity is addressed and what that is doing to the system in the long run. And I thought that came out wonderfully actually in the book. I mean, and I suppose the final point would be in some sense what Radhika said, which is that it's remarkable to read some of the ethnographic stuff and to see how the characters actually are driven and sort of engage with the system, even though they know that they're not going to get anything from it, right? It reminded me what David Lloyd George said of second marriages, that it's the triumph of hope over experience.
So thank you. Thanks, Ma. Pratiksha is one of our very acute and thoughtful commentators on what law does to disadvantaged populations. So Pratiksha, how would you like to respond to the book?
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me, Professor Varshney and Poulami. I also agree that your ethnography is truly remarkable, and it will mark a place of distinction in feminist, in almost inaugurating feminist political sociology in India, what you might call political anthro in the US, but political I can't really think of too much feminist political sociology in our context, right? And so I find the text remarkable for many reasons, but primarily for the very unique way in which you have mainstreamed domestic violence as an ethnographic and theoretical terrain that should concern political sociologists and political theorists. And I particularly like what you have not done, right? So you do not repeat the cliched arguments about gender mainstreaming or governance feminism, which is frankly a huge relief. We are also spared of the cliched sort of debate on whether, law should be a privileged site for feminist activism. There's been so much feminist debate on this question, right? And instead, we are taken through a journey from chapter 3 onwards of how, quote unquote, what Poulami calls illicit justice is brokered by women and a number of other actors who instrumentalize the law for enhancing their capacities. We find a thick description of how a multitude of brokers activate law and learn that the carceral energy of law needs to be activated for women who survive domestic violence, because law in itself does not unleash its carceral energy for women who survive violence to protect them from abusive men. And what's really fascinating is your granular account of how law's monopoly over violence is redistributed, and I wish that was you'd made that point more centrally perhaps in the conclusion, because that's a really powerful ethnographic description. Your book, the book is also refreshing because it steers away from the debates on 498, its misuse and its alleged misuse, and complicated discussion of judgments around the topic. We already have a very rich archive presented to us in 5 volumes by Lawyers Collective on the kind of domestic violence judgments, or the whole rise of the men's rights movement, the idea that these are malevolent women who lie about being abused and misuse the law. Rather, I feel that the originality of your work lies in reconfiguring the question of use and misuse by suggesting that law is a site to broker illicit justice. And one of my questions was, what does illicit justice look like? Yeah, so if you could tease that out for us. The discourse of, you show us how the discourse of bad women is not a stable discourse, and how the very victim, who's initially seen as a bad victim, the police changes its attitude when she's accompanied by a set of people who you call violence brokers. So this poses a very important question to the whole discourse on use and misuse of 498A or whichever other law. The ethnography also makes a very illuminating point on how everyday understanding of domestic violence makes the suffering of women opaque. The idea that the experience of violence is the opposite of love, and that it's women's fault that her husband is not in love with her enough disguises the fact that men find violence sexy. I did wonder whether the narratives of violence and love, of cruelty and abandonment, emerge differently in the ethnography in cases of love marriages versus arranged marriages. Because if you read judgments, you can see different outcomes for dowry violence cases if a woman has chosen her partner. I particularly liked your analytical and ethnographic frameworks of running a family and running a case. Both, these concepts were very powerful and persuasive. So the desire for reconciliation or to run a family seems to detach women from legal remedies, whereas an attachment to the law or desiring the strategic use of law is only possible through directing attachment or desire in another direction, towards the new family, which Radhika also pointed towards, and economic independence. And what you bring for us is a fragile world of solidarity between women with all its hope and heartache. And it's very powerfully etched in your ethnography. And it's not as if this world is romanticized by Poulami. We do pause at an attempted suicide, a reconciliation with an ache as we read these poignant accounts of women who repose their trust and friendship in the ethnographer. So I would actually encourage you to put your ethnographic method up front, because it would be very important for people doing research in this area to engage with your method. I also wanted to join Radhika in commenting about the workshop where the women were encouraged to disrobe. And I was wondering whether these are different techniques of consciousness raising, whether these are transnational techniques, or have these techniques been vernacularized following Sally Mary? And is care also a form of violence following Samina Mullah's work on sexual assault in the US? Yeah. My final sort of comment is on, the discussion around how the police interprets domestic violence. And there's one particular case which struck to me when I was reading this case, the story. I thought that the police could have suggested that the marital sexual violence could have been translated under Section 377, and they don't seem to do that. So, how do they think of marital rape? Because, of course, how does one conceptually then think of domestic violence and sexual assault? And the police's interpretation. And although, while I understand the large portion of the book is not about women who formally file complaints, yet each of these cases seems to be shadowed by some kind of documentary practices. So you have a whole lot of legal anthropologists who've now been writing about documents, right? So Pooja Satyogi's work about how the police work through experiences of cruelty, or you have also, you refer to other kinds of like stamp paper. So from Livia Holden to Srimoy Nandini Ghosh to, there's a whole lot of work which shows that a lot of matrimonial disputes are settled through writing on the stamp paper, even though it doesn't have any validity in a court of law. So I was wondering whether you want to join conversation with some legal anthropologists who've taken documentary practices seriously. So I want to end by congratulating you for giving life to feminist political sociology. And I must say I haven't encountered such a nuanced reading. Like, while in political anthropology we've read about big men, right? Dadas. I have not encountered such a reading of dadas and bibis in a neighborhood as I have in your book, whether this is extra-legal or illicit, in the context of women who negotiate violence. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pratiksha. That was a really rich discussion. So before we open it up to the audience, unfortunately we have enough time for audience discussion. I just thought that you might like to respond to some of the things that was said. I noted a few just to remind you, and you might have taken some things. But the larger conversation about women who may have lost the criminal case but still felt they won the battle. And that really resonated a lot with me, again, in my work in communal violence, where very often we took up a few hundred cases in Gujarat, and we lost most of them in the courts finally. But the survivors who fought these cases actually very often have told me that we might have lost the case in the court, but actually we won the case. And they said, our battle, poor people don't get justice from courts, and we didn't get justice from the courts. But through this process, we fought our despair, we fought our invisibility, we fought this, we asserted our equal citizenship. And I heard some of that in the process. So how can you win while you're losing was something that struck me a lot. I heard Radhika talk about many things, but she talked about how does the law itself encourage the extra-legal? And Pratiksha said, in fact, what you're talking about, the extra-legal, what does the licit look in law? What is licit in law? Madhav talked about this very paradoxical relationship of poor state capacity and its high abuse, which looks paradoxical, and how that works out. There was a very specific question, I think, from Pratiksha also about how does the police look at sexual assault within marriage. And going back to my initial question, this population, the experience of the homeless woman, who does not somehow, who suffers perhaps the greatest violence, but the state does not ever give her the opportunity to become the capable citizen, and how does that fit into your stories?
How long do I have to? 7 minutes. Okay. Yes. Have 5 7. Okay. So you just cut me off, Harsh. Yeah. Okay. Perfect. Okay. Perfect. So first of all, thank you guys for. I can tell how closely you read this book, and the comments were amazing. So thank you. I have a lot to think about, and it's actually very helpful because this is not the final draft, so I'll incorporate what you have said. Okay, so I'll start with maybe the most concise question, or the question that leads to the most concise answer, which is your question about how do the police actually think about sexual violence in the context of marriage, given that rape is not recognized, right? So what's interesting about PWDVA, the Civil Act, right, the 2005 Civil Act, versus 498A, the Criminal Act of 1983, is that PWDVA recognizes sexual abuse. Now, what's interesting is that that is not the same thing as rape, right? So what I noticed consistently is that the police differentiate between demands for sex one time per day and deviant sexual acts, so that a woman can only be sexually abused by her husband when he's demanding things that our culture deems to be perverse. And that can be, oral sex, oh my goodness, now you're sexually abused. But the fact that he wants to and forces you to have sex with him one time every day is not perverse, right? Especially if it's vaginal sex. If it's anal sex, then it's abuse. So that's what I noticed, that pattern of determining abuse through notions of moral perversity that are culturally embedded. Okay, so then I'll turn next to Harsh. Your, I think, very apt critique about who is this book talking about? Now, partly this has to do with the methodological limitations of my book. I do not have homeless women in the 100 cases. And that's probably because they aren't not even able to come forward and seek help of any sort. Exactly. Organizations are also not actively reaching out to them, which means that really the notion of incorporation that I highlight, that the Indian state is incorporating women, it's incorporating certain sectors of women. and that in fact the domestic of the domestic violence is a necessary component to who can be incorporated. So if you do not actually occupy a domestic sphere, then you do not have to be managed in a certain way. Because my book is ultimately saying that the state does have to manage women's claims in ways that it did not have to potentially 40 years ago, 30 years ago. But for some women, they're not actually a managerial problem. So I think that's a very good critique of the limits of the argument. Now, this question that I think both Madhav and Radhika are raising, right, about, and also Pratiksha, about if you're talking about illicit, you also have to talk about the licit. And where do we draw the line, right? Is law fundamentally an illicit activity? And related to that, why on earth? Exactly, yeah. So, and related to that, why on earth, given that everyone, and especially women, are distrustful of law enforcement personnel and of the legal process, why on earth are legal claims actually increasing? Like, why are they moving forward? So I have a two-part answer to that question. And I'm sorry if I don't know how to use this microphone. I feel like I'm like vacillating between being inaudible and very, very loud. So you can hear? Okay. So I have a two-part response to this question of why the law is still attractive to people who will very expressively tell you that they don't trust it. One part of this answer is that the law is not attractive. So none of the women, when I first met them, wanted to approach the state at all. But there are organized actors who benefit from pushing women towards the law. So part of what I'm saying is that women's rights has become an organizational resource in India for diverse actors, not just for women's rights activists, but also for political parties. This is a way that they prove their social usefulness and mobilize support. So the first part of the answer is that they don't actually want to approach the state. The second part of the answer is that just through the process of seeking help and encountering these various organizations, they are transformed by the process, and they start seeing the state as something to, potentially rely on in limited ways or in strategic ways. And there, I think that potentially there is a more nuanced way of thinking of what's going on than, oh, the Indian state has low capacity and it doesn't help anybody. Clearly, this is not a completely broken system. There is a way in which the democratic nature of the Indian state still provides opportunities for marginalized groups to feel like this is a resource, and it might be a resource given that there aren't many other resources available. So I'll end with that.
Thank you, and thank you also all for keeping time, because I was very keen that we have enough time for conversation, and we have all of 15 minutes. So please, anyone from the audience would like to? Yes. Yeah. If you'd like to introduce yourself as well, please.
My name is Kaushiki Sanyal. I had a question for Professor Roychowdhury. You mentioned that the women that you interview mostly approach the police. But there are a system of, informal system of women's adalats or Nari adalats in India where a lot of domestic violence cases are referred to. Did these women that you studied, did they approach those informal systems of justice first before they approach the police? that was what I was interested in. Thank you.
Since we have enough time, I think you could take one question and answer.
Yes, so the answer is yes. They're never approaching the police at first. They don't actually want to go to the police or to the protection officer, right? So Nari Adalats, and my side is West Bengal, so you largely have Mohila Shamitis who are doing this kind of work. And so they're always going to some kind of local resource. But the more interesting point is that what I found is that these organizations have an interest in pushing the women who come to them for arbitration to engage with the state in some limited way. And that's how they themselves make something of themselves, if that makes any sense. Because, hey, I know the cops, I can lead you there, and that relationship is mutually beneficial for members of the Mahila Shamiti. And so the engagement that comes out with the state is actually through the very organizations that you're pointing out.
Yes.
Good evening, everyone. I'm audible?
Yes.
Good evening, everyone. This is N. Salman Khan. I'm a student in Masters in Public Administration, final year, and I'm also a study fellow in geopolitics in SSCI, Western Europe. And my question is that in India, the woman is suffering from malnutrition problem. Everyone knows that the India is one of the worst case in women's malnutrition, and we can say that domestic violence creates a patriarchy in the Indian families, like especially in the nuclear families of India. So thus we can say that this domestic violence can also retaliate in the form of malnutrition, which is creating a grassroots problem of reducing the Indian labor productivity in India. So we can say like that domestic violence can cause this dimension issues. Can we say like that?
So is malnutrition a reflection of violence within the family? Would anyone like to take that on?
That's not the subject of the book.
Pardon? Yeah. Okay, that's an observation, but if anyone would like to... No, okay. Yeah.
I mean, I can't, this is a very important issue. I can't directly speak to it, but other people have written about how malnutrition is linked to inequalities within the home, but also obviously inequalities between different kinds of homes, right? So it's not just a gendered issue. We know that large numbers of people are malnourished, including men. So,
yeah,
but I can't.
But the adverse sex ratio and its declining character reflects many kinds of deprivations, both violence, overt violence, as well as denials of equal access to healthcare and education and nutrition within the family. So I think that is true, and it's a violence that the law doesn't explicitly recognize. Anyone else would like to? Yeah, Ashu.
So, Poulami, the title is Capable Citizens. Our series is publishing it, of course. Glad to do so. But there is a question that I'm not sure when I read the manuscript whether it was answered. It may be that the question doesn't interest you, so not everything can be answered in a book. But it was provoked in the last 30 minutes, or triggered in the last 30 minutes by Harsh's comparison between homeless women who just don't have the capacities, and your capable women. Now, who take law into their own hands and etc. And because the state is unresponsive, and when it does respond, it uses, perhaps misuses power, etc. So, is the question of determinants or how capability is acquired, acquisition of capability, does this question interest you at all? Or in your materials, is there enough variation to get at that question? Some who are failing, and some who are emerging into capability, growing into capability. Does that interest you? Are there enough, enough variation in your cases to be able to answer that question?
Yeah, so this is a very good question, Ashu. And so look, I have 100 cases, so it's not like I can't do the testing that you political scientists love, right? But I can talk about the variation I did find, which is that another way to answer Harsh's question about who is included and excluded from this category of capability is that part of the point of my book is that even the women under my study are not actually included in the, right? Like they can't, most of them can't become capable in this way. This is a discourse that largely serves the interests of state officials whose incapacity also protects them from doing work, right? And taking on a certain burden. So within the 100 cases, it's important for you guys to realize that only 36 of these 100 women actually were able to register an official case, either civil or criminal. Only 10 of those people received an official judgment over, so I did ethnography for 2 years, but I actually did follow-up interviews, so this study covers a 6-year time period, basically. So within that 6 years, like only 10 people had received some sort of formal judgment. And then the other people, some of them are emerging as not getting a formal judgment, but through this process of engagement, they do things like, get unofficial financial contracts, or they secure the ability to stay in a particular house, or they retain custody of their children, or they, run some sort of extra-legal property repossession case, hire, get their buddies together and their organizational help and re-enter the home and grab some stuff. So these are the forms of illicit justice that you see playing out that the criminal justice system is also encouraging because they don't want to do this work. But what I noticed within the sample of women who varied by both income level, religion, so I had Hindus, Muslims, Christians, lower income and middle income. I didn't have any really wealthy women in my sample. If they varied by caste, if they were Hindu, and they also varied by urban and rural location, which is that ultimately, if victimhood is the state directly selecting women largely based on caste-based, class-based, ascriptive categories, right? You're the Bhadra Mohila in the West Bengal case, right? That the system of incorporation, what it does is that it also ultimately advantages those very same women, right? So who can become capable in this system? It's people who already have certain kinds of resources, financial, social networks. So disproportionately, the women who were able to inhabit this subjectivity were already quite advantaged. Very few of them were coming from working class, lower caste backgrounds. They were the ones who were dropping off, disappearing, or trying to take their own life.
Just very brief follow. The organizations that you refer to, that you cover, the organizations are unable to create capability. Or create capability only among those who are relatively networked and relatively better networked, right? They're unable to create a capability among what you would call the very excluded. They're unable to do so. The organizations are not doing it.
There are some exceptions, right? So the 2 women I named, Rupa, they're coming from the very similar social backgrounds. Rupa does become capable to a certain extent in very meaningful ways, right? She has an income, she's supporting herself, and so it does happen to a limited fashion, and that's important to recognize, but not overwhelmingly, from what I found, yeah.
So Poulami, I think your book also casts a lens on how the state responds, copes, when previously excluded and vulnerable groups begin to organize and assert. So do you think that, this is not empirical, this is more speculative, but do you think you would make similar generalizations with, say, assertions by disadvantaged caste groups? And what about a context like in India today where religious minorities are so much in a position of threat? How do you think, does the state even feel compelled to co-opt their assertion, or that's just a speculation. Because your book is also about the state.
This is a tough question, right? Because on the one hand, there's a specificity to gender that's going on in this book and the specific issue that I'm dealing with that creates a certain kind of response from law enforcement personnel. And the reason that matters is because we do know that law enforcement personnel are very biased against women, especially women who say that their husbands are being abusive to them, right? They don't like them, and that creates a certain kind of dynamic, which I don't think we can necessarily generalize to other sorts of issues or other population groups. But I will say that there are people who have been working on these issues, right? The relationship between various marginalized groups and the Indian state around the law, right? So around the Forest Rights Act, we were just talking about Anand Vaidya's work. And I think there's a degree to which they're finding similar kinds of processes unfolding, right? The strategic use of the illegal while also simultaneously heralding the law, right?
Complex empowerment and disempowerment,
Exactly.
and
Yeah.
an empowerment which reduces your own responsibility,
Yes,
which you're trying to tell.
Yes.
I think it's an interesting, at least, hypothesis to look at other.
Yes, exactly. And the need for management on behalf of a democratically accountable state. Now, to your last point, Harsh, it depends on your organizational power, right? So for marginalized groups who do not necessarily have that kind of political clout, I would venture to say that the state does not have to manage
Doesn't
them.
have to. So I think we're just on time, and thank you once again. I think it was, at least for me, a very, very enlightening and interesting, stimulating discussion. We look forward to your final version of your book.
Thank you for this very insightful and moving conversation. May I now request Smita Mathur and Aditi Saxena to please come up on the stage and felicitate our panelists. Yeah, we're now going for a short tea break, and the tea is being served in the foyer area. We come back again at 4 p.m.